All right, ladies, I had realized there were just two quick notes I had left off of the initial PowerPoint, and so if you just open up your Chapter 16 outline, add this brief information into that, just on the bottom of the outline is perfectly fine. Still just kind of talking about the unsettling of the West aspect of this chapter and our disruption of Native American culture that takes place within the U.S. in the late 1800s. We kind of talked about assimilation with the boarding schools, such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, as class was ending on Friday. One other kind of method of this kind of like forced assimilation was actually passed with something called the Dawes Act. So the Dawes Act was passed in 1887, and it authorized the federal government to break up tribal lands and partitioning them into like individual plots. Kind of remember that natives tended to have more fluid, ideas of like property lines. They didn't have, set acreage or fences. They kind of were on an open range format. But as the U.S. is coming to kind of consolidate land in the West, they basically wanted to break up that, large amount of land and divide it into individual sections. And for those Native Americans who accepted, they would be able to have access to the individual allotments and also be on a path to become a U.S. citizen. The reality, though, is that one of the clear objections here is that, of the Dawes Act, is that, they want to kind of forcefully assimilate Native Americans into mainstream U.S. society by kind of getting rid of this cultural tradition of, owning large amounts of land without border or boundary lines. I think that the assumption is if a person adopted white clothing and ways, then, they would next want to own a farm. They would want to work on that farm. And this is really, just the U.S. kind of forcing Eurocentric values on the native people. But for those that accepted, like I said, they would get access to the plots themselves. They would be able to find a path to citizenship. But the other thing to consider is this is going to create an excess of plots available that now the U.S. government can settle and delve, to other non-native individuals. And in fact, as a result of the Dawes Act, over 90 million acres of tribal land were basically stripped from Native Americans and sold to non-natives as part of that, plan. So it wasn't just Indians that would be living on these plots. The last section I wanted to just briefly address was kind of a concluding battle, the Battle of Wounded Knee. I did mention Sitting Bull and kind of like his surrender to the U.S. government when the, Lakota people, the Sioux, were starving to death, essentially, in large part because of the annihilation of the buffalo. But what we see kind of this rebounding, uprising within Native communities that is going to result in a last kind of concluding battle or massacre at a location called Wounded Knee. So Wounded Knee is located in like southwestern South Dakota. It's the site of like multiple conflicts between like the U.S. government and natives, but the battle at Wounded Knee, or the massacre, is going to take place in 1890. So throughout the year 1890, the U.S. government was worried about the increasing influence within this reservation in South Dakota of something called the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance was a spiritual movement within Lakota culture. It taught the Indians, it taught them that they had been defeated and confined to reservations because they had angered the gods by abandoning their traditional customs, and that if they wanted to kind of come out of their situation, they needed to resist, the white man, resist the American government and their reservation style, policies, and they practice this belief through something called the ghost dance, where they are basically rejecting the ways of the white man. And if they believe that if they follow through with this practice, that the gods would create the world anew and destroy all non-believers, including, non-Indians, who don't share those same, spiritual ideologies. The result is, let's be honest, the American government is not believing in the ghost dance premise. They're not concerned about true retribution, naturally coming down upon them. But they do not like this ideology fueling the natives' hopes to potentially launch this uprising and resistance of the U.S. government policies. So by the end of the year, the American police will try to put an end to this. They look at Sitting Bull, who is at this point living on a reservation. They look at him as kind of a ringleader, instigator. He may not be telling people to do this, but he is a symbol of leadership amongst the Sioux. And so in order to kind of halt that, they try to arrest him. In the process, he's actually killed, which unfortunately just increases tension at the reservation in South Dakota. I think the specific reservation name, by the way, is Pine Ridge, but you don't need to stress about that name. By the end of the month, the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry surrounded a group of ghost dancers. And there was a Lakota Sioux chief in the area. His name was Bigfoot. And, they basically demand that the Sioux surrender their weapons. The Sioux will not. And so a fight breaks out between the Indian and the U.S. soldiers. And a brutal massacre follows, in which an estimated 150 Indians were killed. Some assume that number is actually much higher, closer to 300. It's just hard to prove because, I hate to say this, but there's a lot of disruption to the evidence and the corpses of those that were killed. But we do know that probably close to half of those slaughtered were women and children, very similar to the Sand Creek massacre we talked about in the beginning of this section. So we kind of see this hostility, brewing from the U.S. government, throughout this chapter, and the aggression that the U.S. military was willing to use against Native groups if they were seen to be resisting. But in this example, it's almost like they're attacking their spiritual ideals as well, not just, this wasn't a large scale war effort that the Sioux were instigating. It was more of a spiritual, cultural response, and the U.S. is trying to, put an end to that as well. If you have questions about either of these two things, Dawes Act or the Battle at Wounded Knee, Massacre at Wounded Knee, please write them down. I'll ask if we have questions in class this week, and then we'll be moving on. I hope you'll have a great rest of your weekend.